The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I stared at my computer screen, the quarterly reports blurring together after 12 straight hours of work. Chicago's downtown skyline glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Morrison & Associates, one of the city's most prestigious marketing firms. At 26, I thought landing this account executive position would be my big break. Instead, it felt like I was drowning in expectations I couldn't meet. Jordan, my office. Now. The voice belonged to Victoria Sterling, our creative director and the woman who seemed to take personal pleasure in making my life miserable. Her corner office commanded a view of the Chicago River, but I barely noticed as I walked in, my palms already sweating. Victoria didn't look up from her MacBook. Her perfectly styled blonde hair caught the late afternoon sun, and her designer blazer probably cost more than my monthly rent. She had that effortless confidence that came from never having to prove herself to anyone. "The Brennan Industries pitches tomorrow," she said, her fingers never pausing on the keyboard. "I've reviewed your presentation materials." My stomach dropped. I'd spent 3 weeks on that campaign, working nights and weekends to perfect every slide, every tagline, every strategic angle. Brennan Industries was a mid-sized manufacturing company looking to rebrand their image for younger consumers. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. "And?" I managed to ask. She finally looked up, her ice blue eyes scanning me like I was something she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. "It's adequate. Barely. The creative direction lacks innovation, the market analysis is surface level, and frankly, I'm not sure you have what it takes for this level of client." Each word hit like a physical blow. I'd given everything to that presentation. I'd researched Brennan's competitors, analyzed their target demographics, created what I thought was a fresh, authentic campaign that honored their blue-collar roots while appealing to millennials. I could revise the creative elements, I offered, my voice smaller than I intended. Maybe add some more contemporary design choices or... "Jordan." She stood up, walking around her desk to lean against it, arms crossed. "Let me be clear. This isn't about tweaking a few slides. This is about whether you belong in this industry at all." The office suddenly felt too small, too bright. Outside, I could hear the muffled sounds of my colleagues packing up for the day, heading home to their families, their normal lives. "I've been in this business for 15 years, Victoria continued, her voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd learned to dread. "I can spot someone who has it and someone who doesn't from a mile away. And you, Jordan, simply don't have the killer instinct this job requires." I wanted to argue, to defend myself, to point out the successful campaigns I'd assisted on, the positive feedback from smaller clients. But the words stuck in my throat. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was kidding myself thinking I could compete in this cutthroat world. "The Brennan meeting is at 10 tomorrow, she said, returning to her desk. "I'll be presenting your materials, but don't expect to do much talking. In fact, it's probably better if you just observe. Take notes. Learn how it's actually done." Walking back to my cubicle felt like a death march. My coworkers had mostly left, leaving the office in that strange twilight state between day and night shifts. I slumped into my chair, staring at the presentation I'd been so proud of just hours earlier. My phone buzzed with a text from my roommate Mason. "Pizza tonight? You've been living on coffee and stress for weeks." I typed back, "Rain check. Still at office." 3 dots appeared then, "Dude, they're working you to death. When's the last time you had a real meal?" I couldn't remember. The past month had been a blur of deadlines, revisions, and Victoria's increasingly harsh critiques. I'd been running on adrenaline and ambition, convinced that if I just worked harder, stayed later, proved myself more thoroughly, I'd finally earn her respect. Instead, I felt smaller than ever. The cleaning crew arrived around 9, their quiet efficiency a stark contrast to the chaos in my head. One of them, an older Hispanic woman named Carmen who always smiled when she saw me working late, paused by my desk. "You okay, Mijo?" she asked softly. "You look tired." "Just a big presentation tomorrow," I said, managing a weak smile. She nodded knowingly. "My daughter, she works in marketing too. Always telling me about the pressure, the competition." She leaned in conspiratorially. "But you know what I tell her? The best ideas, they don't come from trying to be like everyone else. They come from being yourself." After she moved on, I sat in the quiet office, her words echoing in my mind. Being myself. When had I stopped doing that? When had I started trying so hard to become what I thought Victoria wanted that I'd lost sight of what made me good at this job in the first place? I pulled up the Brennan presentation one more time, really looking at it. The campaign I'd created wasn't flashy or cutting edge, but it was honest. It spoke to the pride of American manufacturing, the value of quality craftsmanship, the bridge between tradition and innovation. It wasn't trying to be something it wasn't. Maybe that was the problem. Maybe I wasn't trying to be something I wasn't either. By the time I finally left the office, Michigan Avenue was quiet except for the occasional taxi and the distant sound of the L train. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of lake water and the promise of winter. I walked the 15 blocks to my apartment, needing the movement, needing to clear my head. Tomorrow would either make or break my career at Morrison & Associates. But for the first time in weeks, I wasn't thinking about Victoria's approval or my coworkers' opinions. I was thinking about Carmen's daughter, about being myself, about the possibility that maybe, just maybe, adequate was exactly what Brennan Industries needed. The next morning came too soon and not soon enough. I'd barely slept, alternating between rehearsing key points from my presentation and staring at the ceiling, wondering if I should start updating my resume. The shower water was lukewarm at best, another reminder that my Lincoln Park studio apartment was about as far from Victoria's Gold Coast lifestyle as you could get while still living in the same city. I chose my clothes carefully, a navy blue suit from Men's Warehouse that I'd bought with my first paycheck, a crisp white shirt, and my father's vintage tie, the one he'd worn to every important business meeting during his 20-year career in manufacturing. Looking in the mirror, I saw a younger version of him, the same determined jaw, the same brown eyes that could look confident even when I felt anything but. The Morrison & Associates office was already buzzing when I arrived at 8:30. Victoria was in her office with the door closed, probably strategizing with the senior partners. I used the time to review my notes one more time, not the sanitized version Victoria expected me to present, but my original vision for the campaign. At 9:45, she emerged wearing a charcoal gray power suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Her expression was all business as she gathered the presentation materials. "Ready for your learning experience?" she asked, not really expecting an answer. Brennan Industries was headquartered in a converted warehouse in River North, the kind of building that had housed actual manufacturing decades ago before gentrification turned the area into a playground for tech startups and artisanal coffee shops. But Brennan had kept the industrial aesthetic: exposed brick walls, polished concrete floors, and original steel beams that spoke to their heritage. Tom Brennan met us in the lobby personally. He was in his 50s, with graying hair and hands that looked like they'd actually operated machinery at some point in his life. His handshake was firm, genuine, and he made eye contact with both Victoria and me equally. "Welcome to Brennan Industries," he said, his voice carrying a slight Chicago accent. "I'm excited to see what you've put together for us." We followed him to a conference room that managed to be professional without being pretentious. The table was solid oak, surrounded by leather chairs that had seen actual use. Framed photos on the walls showed the company's history, black and white images of the original factory, workers in hard hats, products being built by hand. Joining Tom was his daughter Ashley, a woman about my age who served as their marketing manager, and Robert Chin, their CFO. Ashley had her father's direct manner but with an energy that suggested she was the one pushing the company toward modernization. "Before we start," Tom said, settling into his chair, "I want you to know what we're looking for. We've been in business for 43 years. Started by my father in a garage on the south side. We make quality products: industrial lighting systems, electrical components, nothing glamorous but essential. Our customers have been loyal because we deliver what we promise." He paused, looking around the room. "But we're losing ground to competitors who figured out how to appeal to younger purchasing managers. Companies that make our products look old-fashioned, out of touch. We need to evolve without losing who we are." Victoria opened her laptop with practiced efficiency. "We completely understand your position, Mr. Brennan. Morrison & Associates has extensive experience helping established companies navigate modern market challenges." She launched into the presentation I'd created, but her delivery transformed it into something unrecognizable. Every slide became about disruption, about bold new directions, about completely reimagining the Brennan brand identity. She used terms like paradigm shift and millennial-focused disruption strategy that had never appeared in my original concept. I watched Tom's face growing more skeptical with each slide. Ashley was taking notes, but her expression suggested she was writing down concerns rather than excitement. Robert kept glancing at his watch. "Our recommendation," Victoria concluded, "is a complete visual overhaul. New logo, new color scheme, new messaging that positions Brennan as the innovative disruptor in industrial lighting. We're talking about transformation, not just evolution." The room fell silent. Tom leaned back in his chair, studying the final slide that showed a sleek, minimalist logo that looked like it belonged to a Silicon Valley startup. "This is certainly bold," he said carefully. "But I have to ask, where's Brennan in all of this? This could be any company. There's nothing here that speaks to our history, our values, our relationship with our customers." Victoria's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Brennan, with respect, holding on to the past is exactly what's limiting your growth. Today's consumers don't care about 43 years of history. They care about innovation, about being associated with brands that represent the future." "But our customers do care about our history," Ashley interjected. "That's what differentiates us from manufacturers who outsource everything overseas. Our clients know that when they work with Brennan, they're getting American-made quality from people who've been perfecting these products for decades." I felt my heart racing. This was exactly what I'd understood about Brennan when I'd researched their company, their industry, their customers. But Victoria was already responding. "That's precisely the kind of limited thinking that keeps companies stuck in the past," she said, her voice taking on an edge. "You hired us because you recognize that your current approach isn't working. If you want different results, you need to be willing to embrace different strategies." Tom's jaw tightened. "Miss Sterling, we hired you because we were told Morrison and Associates understands how to help companies grow while staying true to their core identity. What you're proposing isn't evolution, it's erasure." The tension in the room was palpable. Victoria's carefully maintained composure was starting to crack, and I could see the meeting slipping away. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd hoped to achieve, was crumbling in real time. And then something inside me snapped. Maybe it was watching Victoria misrepresent months of my research and insights. Maybe it was seeing the disappointment on Tom Brennan's face as he realized we didn't understand his company at all. Maybe it was remembering Carmen's words about being yourself, about the best ideas coming from authenticity rather than imitation. "Excuse me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Mr. Brennan, may I share a different perspective?" Victoria's head whipped around so fast I thought she might get whiplash. Her eyes were furious, but before she could speak, Tom nodded. "Please do." I stood up, my legs unsteady but my mind suddenly crystal clear. What Miss Sterling presented isn't actually what I researched and developed for Brennan Industries. The silence in the room was deafening. I could feel Victoria's anger radiating across the table, but I pressed on. "The campaign I created is built around the idea that Brennan's history isn't a liability, it's your greatest asset. In an era when consumers are increasingly skeptical of companies that seem inauthentic or purely profit-driven, you have something most businesses spend millions trying to create: genuine credibility." I moved to the whiteboard at the front of the room, grabbing a marker. "Instead of hiding your 43 years in business, we celebrate it. Instead of making you look like every other tech startup, we position you as the alternative, the company that builds things to last, that stands behind their products, that represents the best of American manufacturing tradition while embracing modern efficiency and innovation." As I talked, I found myself drawing connections I hadn't fully articulated before. The words flowed naturally, backed by weeks of research and genuine understanding of what made Brennan special. "Your target market isn't just millennials," I continued. "It's purchasing managers who are tired of dealing with companies that overpromise and underdeliver. It's decision makers who understand that the cheapest option often costs more in the long run. It's people who want to work with a company they can trust." Ashley was leaning forward now, engaged. Even Robert had stopped checking his watch. But it was Tom's expression that told me I was on the right track. He looked like someone who was finally being understood. "The tagline I developed is built to last, built to lead. It acknowledges both your heritage and your innovation. The visual identity honors your industrial roots while feeling contemporary and professional. The messaging strategy focuses on reliability, quality, and the peace of mind that comes from working with a company that's been solving these problems for 4 decades. I turned back to the table, my heart pounding. This isn't about disruption for disruption's sake. This is about helping your existing customers remember why they chose Brennan in the first place, while giving new customers a compelling reason to choose you over competitors who might be flashier but lack your substance." The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Tom smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him all morning. "Now that," he said, "sounds like someone who actually understands our business." But before anyone could respond further, Victoria stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I need to speak with my colleague privately," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Would you excuse us for a moment?" Tom nodded, though his expression suggested he was beginning to understand the dynamic between Victoria and me. Victoria gestured sharply toward the door. I followed her into the hallway, my temporary confidence already evaporating as I realized what I'd just done. She waited until we were out of earshot, then turned on me with a fury I'd never seen before. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she hissed, her voice low but venomous. "You just completely undermined me in front of a client. You made me look incompetent. I was just trying to." "You were trying to what? Save the day? Be the hero?" Her eyes were blazing. "You're a junior account executive, Jordan. You're nobody. You have no right to contradict me, no right to present alternative strategies, no right to do anything except sit there and take notes like I told you to." Each word hit like a slap. The confidence I'd felt moments earlier was draining away, replaced by the familiar sensation of being small, inadequate, out of my depth. "Victoria, please, I was just—" "You're weak, Jordan." The words came out as a hiss, her face inches from mine. "You're weak, you're inexperienced, and you're delusional if you think some feel-good presentation about heritage and tradition is going to impress anyone. This is business, not a heartwarming story about American manufacturing." She turned to head back into the conference room, then paused. "When we get back in there, you're going to apologize for the confusion, explain that you misspoke, and let me handle the rest of this meeting. And after we leave, we're going to have a very serious conversation about your future at Morrison & Associates." I stood in that hallway, her words echoing in my mind. "You're weak. You're weak. You're weak." Maybe she was right. Maybe I just destroyed my career over a moment of misguided idealism. Maybe I really didn't belong in this industry. But as I looked through the glass wall of the conference room, I saw Tom Brennan explaining something to his daughter, gesturing with the kind of passion that came from genuine pride in what he'd built. I saw Ashley nodding, engaged in a way she hadn't been during Victoria's presentation. I saw Robert looking at something on his tablet, probably crunching numbers based on what I'd proposed. And I realized something that surprised me. I might be weak, but I wasn't wrong. Walking back into that conference room felt like entering a courtroom where my professional death sentence was about to be pronounced. Victoria's words still rang in my ears, "You're weak, you're weak, you're weak," and my hands were trembling slightly as I took my seat. The Brennan team was waiting expectantly, but I could see the uncertainty in their faces. They'd witnessed something uncomfortable in the hallway, even if they couldn't hear the specifics. Victoria had composed herself with impressive speed, her professional mask firmly back in place. She smoothed her blazer and sat down with the kind of calculated grace that came from years of corporate maneuvering. "I apologize for the interruption," she said, her voice honey smooth. "There seems to have been some miscommunication about our strategic approach." Tom Brennan leaned forward, his weathered hands folded on the table. "Actually, Miss Sterling, I'd like to hear more about what Jordan was proposing. It sounded like there might be two different visions for this campaign." I felt Victoria's eyes boring into me, but something had shifted during those moments in the hallway. Her words had been meant to diminish me, to put me back in my place, but instead they'd crystallized something I'd been struggling with for months. I wasn't weak for caring about authenticity. I wasn't weak for believing that good marketing should serve the client's actual needs rather than the agency's ego. "There are," I said quietly. "Two different visions, I mean." Victoria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Jordan, perhaps you should—" "No, let him speak," Ashley interrupted, her voice carrying the same directness as her father's. "I want to understand what you're proposing." I took a deep breath, pushing past the voice in my head that sounded suspiciously like Victoria telling me to stay quiet, take notes, know my place. The vision Miss Sterling presented is certainly bold, and there are companies where complete reinvention might be the right strategy. But Brennan Industries isn't one of those companies. I stood up again, feeling steadier this time. "You're not broken. You don't need fixing. What you need is amplification, helping the market understand and appreciate what you've already built." Moving to the whiteboard, I began sketching out a different kind of presentation. "Your competitors are trying to win on price or flashiness. But you have something they can't buy or fake. Decades of actual expertise, relationships built on trust, a track record of solving problems that matter." As I talked, I found myself drawing on memories of my father's stories about manufacturing, about the pride that came from building things that lasted. I thought about the companies he'd worked with, the values that had driven his career, the respect he'd earned from colleagues who knew his word was his bond. "The campaign I'm proposing celebrates that expertise," I continued, turning back to face the table. "Instead of trying to look like a tech startup, we position Brennan as the experienced alternative. Instead of promising disruption, we promise reliability. Instead of asking customers to take a risk on the new guy, we remind them why they should stick with the proven leader." Tom was nodding slowly. "Give me an example. How would that look in practice?" Without thinking, I grabbed one of the sample products from the display shelf, an industrial LED fixture that looked deceptively simple but probably represented years of engineering refinement. "This isn't just a light fixture," I said, holding it up. "This is the result of 43 years of solving real problems for real customers." When an airport installs Brennan lighting systems, they're not just buying products, they're buying the peace of mind that comes from working with people who understand that failure isn't an option. I set the fixture on the table. The marketing message isn't, "We're young and disruptive." It's, "We've been perfecting this longer than our competitors have been in business." The visual identity doesn't try to hide your industrial heritage, it celebrates it. The website doesn't look like every other corporate site because you're not every other company. Ashley was taking notes rapidly now. "What about reaching younger decision makers?" "That's been our biggest challenge." "Younger doesn't mean they want to work with amateurs," I replied. "Millennials in purchasing roles are often dealing with tight budgets and high expectations. They want vendors who won't let them down, who won't disappear after 6 months, who have the experience to solve problems they haven't even encountered yet." I turned to Robert. "From a financial perspective, this approach lets you compete on value rather than price. Instead of getting into bidding wars with overseas manufacturers, you're selling expertise, reliability, and long-term partnership." Robert looked intrigued. "The margins would certainly be better than trying to compete on cost alone." Throughout this exchange, Victoria had been sitting in rigid silence. But I could see her composure finally starting to crack. Her hands were clenched in her lap, and a muscle in her jaw was twitching. Tom leaned back in his chair, studying me with the kind of attention that felt both encouraging and terrifying. "Jordan, how long have you been working on this campaign?" "About 3 months, sir. I spent time researching your industry, your competitors, your customer base. I visited manufacturing facilities, talked to purchasing managers, studied successful campaigns in similar industries." 3 months of research, Tom repeated, then looked at Victoria. "And this wasn't the presentation you planned to show us?" The moment stretched out like a taut wire. Victoria's professional mask was slipping, revealing something harder, more desperate underneath. "Mr. Brennan," she said, her voice strained, "I think there's been a significant misunderstanding here. Jordan is a junior employee who lacks the strategic experience necessary to understand our business?" Tom interrupted, his tone sharpening. "Because from where I'm sitting, he seems to understand it better than anyone else who's walked through our doors in the past year." Ashley nodded emphatically. "Dad's right. Every other agency has tried to convince us we need to abandon everything that makes us distinctive. Jordan's the first person who's suggested that our history might actually be an asset." Victoria stood up abruptly, her chair rolling backward. "I think we need to step back and consider the bigger picture here. Morrison and Associates has a proven track record of what?" Tom asked. "Convincing companies to abandon their identities in favor of generic modernization? Making everyone look the same?" The room fell silent except for the hum of the building's ventilation system. Victoria looked like she'd been slapped. Her carefully constructed authority was crumbling in real time, and she seemed to realize that everything she'd said about my weakness, my inexperience, my lack of strategic thinking was being contradicted by the client's reaction. "I need to make a phone call," she said finally, her voice tight. "Jordan, stay here and answer any questions they might have." She walked out without waiting for a response, leaving me alone with the Brennan team and a growing sense that I'd just crossed a line from which there might be no return. Tom watched Victoria leave, then turned back to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "That was interesting." "I'm sorry," I said automatically. "I didn't mean to create conflict or undermine." "Don't apologize," Ashley interrupted. "What you just presented is exactly what we've been looking for. Someone who actually gets what we're about." Robert nodded. "The financial projections alone make more sense than anything we've heard. Competing on value instead of price, building long-term relationships instead of chasing quick sales, that's sustainable business strategy." Tom stood up and extended his hand. "Jordan, I don't know what's going to happen with your boss, and I don't know what kind of politics you're dealing with at your agency. But I want you to know that what you've presented today is exactly the direction we want to go." Shaking his hand felt surreal. "Thank you, sir. That means more than you know." "The question is," Ashley said, looking toward the door Victoria had disappeared through, "what happens now? Because if that presentation is any indication, there seems to be some serious disagreement about how this campaign should proceed." Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "Conference room. Now." I looked at the message, then at the 3 faces watching me expectantly. Tom Brennan had built a successful company from nothing. Ashley was fighting to help it evolve without losing its soul. Robert was trying to ensure its financial future. And Victoria Sterling was probably planning to fire me for insubordination. I should probably go talk to Miss Sterling, I said, though every instinct was telling me to stay in this room where my ideas were valued, where my months of work were finally being appreciated. Jordan, Tom said as I headed toward the door. Whatever happens next, you should know that you've got something most people in your industry seem to have lost. What's that? Integrity. And the courage to stand behind your convictions. I found Victoria in an empty conference room down the hall, pacing like a caged animal. Her phone was on the table, and I could see she'd been texting rapidly, probably with her bosses, probably about me. She turned when I walked in, and her expression was unlike anything I'd seen from her before. The controlled corporate facade was gone, replaced by raw fury mixed with something that looked almost like panic. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" she asked, her voice low and dangerous. "I presented the campaign I developed for Brennan Industries. You humiliated me in front of a client. You made me look incompetent and uninformed. You completely destroyed my credibility." I felt a flash of anger. "I did my job. I gave the client what they needed instead of what you thought would impress them." "Your job." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Your job is to do what I tell you to do. Your job is to support my vision, not undermine it with some naive fantasy about heritage and tradition. My job is to serve the client's best interests. Your job is whatever I say it is." The words came out as a shout, echoing off the conference room walls. Victoria immediately looked around, checking if anyone had heard, then lowered her voice again. "You're a junior account executive. You make $38,000 a year. You live in a studio apartment and eat ramen for dinner. You are nobody, Jordan. Nobody." Each word was calculated to hurt, to remind me of my place in the hierarchy, to put me back in the box where she could control me. "And you know what the worst part is?" she continued. "They don't actually care about your ideas. They're just impressed by the novelty of someone kissing their ass and telling them they're perfect the way they are. But when it comes time to write the check, when they realize that your feel-good approach won't actually drive results, they'll blame you. Not me. You." She moved closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You think you're being brave, standing up for your convictions? You're being stupid. You're throwing away your career for a client who will forget your name in 6 months." I really looked at her and saw something I hadn't noticed before. Behind the designer clothes and practiced confidence was someone who was afraid. Afraid of being wrong, afraid of losing control, afraid that maybe, just maybe, the junior account executive she'd been dismissing for months might actually know something she didn't. "Victoria," I said quietly, "I'm not trying to humiliate you or undermine your authority. But I can't pretend that what you presented in there was right for Brennan Industries. I can't watch you convince them to abandon everything that makes them special just so we can claim we drove transformation." She stared at me for a long moment, her expression cycling through anger, disbelief, and something that might have been respect before settling back into cold fury. "Fine," she said finally. "You want to be the hero? You want to save the day with your authentic, heartfelt approach? Let's see how that works out for you." She gathered her things and headed for the door. "I'm going back to the office to brief the partners on what happened here today. I'm going to tell them that you went rogue, that you undermined a senior director, that you created chaos in front of a major client." She paused at the door. "And then we'll see who's weak." The elevator ride back to Morrison & Associates felt like ascending to my own execution. Victoria stood beside me in icy silence, her fingers flying across her phone screen as she undoubtedly crafted the narrative that would end my career. Each floor that passed brought me closer to what I was sure would be the most humiliating professional conversation of my life. The office buzzed with its usual afternoon energy, but I felt like I was seeing it through a fog. Colleagues I'd worked alongside for 2 years barely looked up as we walked past. Did they already know? Had Victoria's version of events already spread through the office grapevine? My office. 5 minutes, Victoria said as soon as we reached our floor. She disappeared behind her door, leaving me to sit at my desk and contemplate the ruins of what I'd thought would be my career-making presentation. My computer screen showed 17 unread emails, but I couldn't focus on any of them. Instead, I found myself staring at the framed photo on my desk, a picture of my father and me at his retirement party 2 years ago. He'd spent his entire career in manufacturing, working his way up from line supervisor to plant manager through sheer competence and integrity. He'd never made a lot of money, but he'd earned something more valuable: the respect of everyone who worked with him. What would he think about what I'd done today? Would he be proud that I'd stood up for my convictions, or disappointed that I'd jeopardized my future over a single client? Jordan. Victoria's voice cut through my thoughts. Now. Her office felt smaller than usual, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across her polished desk. She'd positioned herself behind it like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict, her laptop open, her phone recording our conversation. I've just finished briefing Richard Morrison and Susan Associates about today's events, she began, her voice professionally neutral. They're as concerned as I am about what happened at Brennan Industries. Richard Morrison was the founding partner, a man I'd met exactly twice in my 2 years at the firm. Susan Associates handled the business development side of things. Having my name mentioned in conversations at that level was either very good or very bad, and given Victoria's expression, I was pretty sure which one it was. I explained that you went off script, contradicted established strategy, and created confusion in front of a major prospective client, she continued. They want to see you in the main conference room in 10 minutes. My mouth went dry. The main conference room was where they held partnership meetings, major client presentations, and presumably termination conversations for employees who'd overstepped their bounds. Before we go, Victoria said, leaning back in her chair, I want to give you one last chance to salvage this situation. When we walk into that room, you can apologize for today's confusion, acknowledge that you acted inappropriately, and commit to following established protocols going forward. She paused, studying my face. Or you can continue with this misguided hero complex and face the consequences. The choice is yours, Jordan. But choose carefully. I sat there for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision. Victoria was offering me a way out, a chance to keep my job and my steady paycheck. All I had to do was admit that my months of research were wrong, that my understanding of Brennan Industries was misguided, that the client's positive response was somehow irrelevant. All I had to do was agree that she was right and I was weak. My phone buzzed with a text message. Normally I would have ignored it, but something made me glance at the screen. It was from Ashley Brennan. Jordan wanted you to know we've made our decision. We'd like to move forward with your campaign approach. When can we meet to discuss next steps? I stared at the message, reading it twice to make sure I hadn't imagined it. Then I looked up at Victoria, who was watching me with growing impatience. They chose my approach, I said quietly. What? I turned my phone screen toward her. Brennan Industries. They want to move forward with my campaign. Victoria's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, anger, and something that might have been fear. She grabbed her own phone and started dialing. Tom, this is Victoria Sterling from Morrison and Associates, she said when someone answered. Her voice was strained but professional. I wanted to follow up on today's presentation and clarify our next steps. I couldn't hear Tom's response, but I could see Victoria's expression growing more tense with each word. I see, she said finally. And you're certain that's the direction you want to pursue? Because I think there might be some misunderstanding about the strategic implications of. She stopped talking abruptly, listening to whatever Tom was saying on the other end. Of course, she said through gritted teeth. We'll be in touch about implementation details. She hung up and stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before, part fury, part bewilderment, and part something that looked almost like grudging respect. They specifically requested that you lead the account, she said slowly. Tom Brennan told me that your understanding of their business was exactly what they'd been looking for, and that they want you as their primary point of contact. The words hung in the air between us. Outside her office, I could see my colleagues going about their normal routines, completely unaware that my professional world had just turned upside down. Victoria, I started, but she held up a hand. We still need to meet with the partners, she said, but her tone had changed. The righteous anger was still there, but it was mixed with something else: uncertainty, maybe even a hint of damage control. The walk to the main conference room felt different this time. Victoria walked beside me rather than ahead, and I could sense her mental wheels turning, probably recalculating how to present the situation to the partners now that the client had chosen my approach over hers. Richard Morrison and Susan Associates were waiting for us at the mahogany conference table that dominated the room. Richard was in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of steady confidence that came from building a successful business from scratch. Susan was younger, probably in her 40s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a reputation for closing deals that seemed impossible. Jordan, Richard said as we sat down, Victoria has briefed us on today's events. Sounds like it was an interesting meeting. I nodded, not sure how much Victoria had actually told them versus how much she was still planning to reveal. Why don't you walk us through what happened? Susan said. Your perspective. I glanced at Victoria, who was sitting rigidly in her chair, then decided to just tell the truth. I spent 3 months researching Brennan Industries, their market, their competitors, and their customers. Based on that research, I developed a campaign strategy that honored their heritage while positioning them for growth. Ms. Sterling felt that approach was too conservative, so she modified the presentation to focus on complete brand transformation. Richard leaned forward. And the client's reaction? They responded negatively to the transformation approach. They felt it didn't understand their core values or their relationship with their customers. When I presented the original strategy I'd developed, they were much more engaged. Engaged enough to choose our agency? Susan asked. Yes. They specifically requested that I lead the account going forward. The room fell silent. Richard and Susan exchanged a look that seemed to communicate volumes. Victoria, Richard said finally, what's your read on the situation? Victoria straightened her shoulders. Richard, I think we need to be careful about setting a precedent where junior employees can override senior strategy. Regardless of the outcome, there are questions about process, about hierarchy, about getting results, Susan interrupted. Victoria, we're not running a military operation here. We're running a business. And if a junior employee strategy wins us a client, I'm more interested in understanding why that happened than in preserving organizational charts. She turned to me. Jordan, tell me about your research process. What did you learn about Brennan that informed your strategy? For the next 20 minutes, I walked them through everything I'd discovered about the industrial lighting market, about Brennan's competitive position, about the purchasing decision-making process in their industry. I talked about the manufacturing executives I'd interviewed, the trade publications I'd studied, the competitive analysis I'd conducted. Richard took notes throughout my presentation. Susan asked pointed questions about market sizing, competitive threats, and growth opportunities. Victoria sat in increasingly uncomfortable silence as it became clear that my research was far more comprehensive than she'd realized. This is impressive work, Richard said when I finished. How long did you say you spent on this? About 3 months, sir. I was working on other accounts during that time, but I spent most of my evenings and weekends on Brennan research. Unpaid time, Susan noted. You did this on your own initiative. Yes, ma'am. I wanted to make sure we really understood their business before proposing solutions. Richard closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair. Victoria, I have to ask, if Jordan put this much work into understanding the client, why wasn't his strategy the one you planned to present? Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. Because he's a junior account executive. Because he doesn't have the strategic experience to understand the complexities of brand positioning. Because you thought you knew better, Susan said quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria looked like she'd been physically struck. Victoria, Richard said, his voice gentle but firm, you're a talented creative director. You've done excellent work for this firm. But what happened today suggests we might need to reconsider how we approach client strategy development. He turned to me. Jordan, we're promoting you to Senior Account Manager, effective immediately. You'll lead the Brennan Industries account with full strategic authority. Victoria will support you on the creative execution side, but you'll be the client's primary contact and the strategic lead on the campaign. I felt the room spinning slightly. Senior Account Manager. Strategic authority. Leading an account instead of just supporting one. Additionally, Susan added, we're implementing a new policy where account strategy must be based on documented research and client insights, not just creative intuition. Jordan's approach will become the template for how we develop all future campaigns. Victoria stood up abruptly. This is unacceptable. You're essentially demoting me based on one client meeting, one disagreement about strategic direction. Victoria, Richard said calmly, we're not demoting you. We're recognizing that Jordan's approach was more effective, and we're adjusting our processes accordingly. You're still the creative director. You're still a valuable part of this team. But you'll be working with account managers who've done the kind of comprehensive research Jordan demonstrated today. She looked around the room, her face cycling through anger, humiliation, and what might have been the beginning of understanding. Finally, she gathered her things and walked toward the door. This isn't over, she said, though her voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. After she left, Richard and Susan turned their attention back to me. That was well handled, Susan said. Professional, factual, focused on results. But I have to ask, are you prepared for what comes next? Leading an account is different from supporting one. The client will expect you to solve their problems, deliver results, and manage their relationship with our entire team. I thought about Tom Brennan's handshake, about Ashley's enthusiasm, about the months of research that had finally paid off. I thought about my father's career, built on competence and integrity rather than politics and positioning. "Yes, ma'am. I'm ready." Richard smiled. "Good. Because Tom Brennan called me personally after you left their office today. He said, and I quote, 'That young man understands our business better than anyone we've worked with. We want him leading this campaign.'" As we walked out of the conference room, I felt like I was seeing the office with completely new eyes. The same cubicles, the same fluorescent lights, the same colleagues, but everything had changed. I wasn't just someone who supported other people's strategies anymore. I was someone who developed them. My phone buzzed with another message, this time from my father. "How did the big presentation go today? Proud of you no matter what." I smiled, typing back, "It went better than expected. I'll call you tonight and tell you all about it." As I settled back at my desk, soon to be a much better desk in a much better office, I thought about Victoria's words from that morning. "You're weak, Jordan. You're nobody." Maybe I had been weak in some ways. Maybe I had been too willing to defer to authority, too afraid to trust my own research and instincts. But today had taught me something important. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is refuse to back down from what you know is right. The Brennan Industries account would officially launch next week. We'd be developing television ads, digital campaigns, trade show materials, and a complete website redesign based on the Built to Last, Built to Lead strategy. It was going to be months of work, challenges I'd never faced before, pressure and responsibility that would test everything I thought I knew about this business. But as I looked at the research folders I'd compiled over the past 3 months, at the notes I'd taken during countless interviews with manufacturing executives, at the competitive analysis that had informed every strategic decision, I felt something I hadn't experienced in my 2 years at Morrison & Associates. Confidence. Not the borrowed confidence that came from following someone else's lead, but the earned confidence that came from doing the work, understanding the problem, and finding solutions that actually served the client's needs. Victoria had been wrong about a lot of things, but she'd been right about one. This business wasn't for everyone. It required strength, conviction, and the ability to stand behind your ideas even when more senior people disagreed with you. The difference was, she thought strength meant never admitting you might be wrong. I'd learned that real strength meant never pretending you were right when you weren't. My computer chimed with an email from Tom Brennan. "Jordan, looking forward to working with you on this campaign. Ashley and I were talking after you left, and we're excited about the possibilities. When can we schedule our kickoff meeting?" I started typing my response, already thinking about the research I'd need to do, the strategies I'd need to develop, the results I'd need to deliver. It was going to be the challenge of my career so far. But for the first time since I'd started working at Morrison & Associates, I couldn't wait to get started. 6 months later, the Brennan Industries campaign had exceeded every projection. Sales were up 37%, brand recognition had doubled, and they'd received inquiries from potential customers who specifically mentioned being impressed by their heritage and stability. Tom Brennan had recommended us to 3 other manufacturing companies, turning one successful campaign into a growing specialty practice. Victoria and I had found a working relationship that, while not exactly friendly, was professionally productive. She'd adapted to the new research-based approach to strategy development, and her creative execution of my campaigns had been consistently excellent. More importantly, she'd stopped questioning my right to be in the room. But the real validation had come 3 weeks earlier, when I'd received a handwritten note from Tom Brennan. "Jordan, wanted you to know that the campaign you developed didn't just help us win new customers. It reminded us why we're proud of what we've built. Sometimes it takes an outsider to help you see your own strengths clearly. Thank you for understanding our story and helping us tell it better, Tom." I'd framed that note and put it on my new office wall, right next to the picture of my father and me at his retirement party. Both reminders of what happened when you combined hard work with integrity, when you chose to do what was right instead of what was easy. The view from my new office looked out over Lake Michigan, and on clear days I could see all the way to the horizon. It was a long way from that cramped cubicle where I'd started, both literally and figuratively. Sometimes I thought about that moment in the Brennan Industries conference room when Victoria had hissed those words, "You're weak, Jordan. You're weak." She'd been trying to make me smaller, to convince me that I didn't belong, that my ideas didn't matter, that my months of research were worthless compared to her years of experience. Instead, she'd forced me to discover something I might never have learned otherwise, that real strength isn't about never being challenged or criticized. It's about knowing when to stand up for what you believe in, even when the people with more power and better titles tell you you're wrong. Especially then. The industrial lighting market might not be glamorous, but it had taught me everything I needed to know about business, about strategy, and about the kind of professional I wanted to be. Built to last, built to lead. It wasn't just a tagline for Brennan Industries. It had become my personal mission statement too.